Hello, I'm Carl Stabe, and today I have Joe Ferraro with me. I am so happy that you're here. You have the 1% Better podcast, and you're the founder of Damn Good Conversations. So I'm excited to have you on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing great. I love the Pennsylvania pronunciation of Ferraro, right? My whole life I was Joe Ferraro. Moved to New York, all of a sudden we're getting the Latin ah coming in, Joe Ferraro. So I've actually adopted Ferraro, but my true Pennsylvania people like you, Carl, you go all the way Ferraro. So everybody is going to be excited to hear that. Thank you so much for having me, man.
Yeah, you're welcome. I am terrible with pronouncing. I'm terrible with names in general. So you just got a little flavor of my struggles with last names and
No
first
problem.
names is too. Although you do have an easy first name, so that helps.
Yeah.
Okay, so you build a brand around helping people have damn good conversations. How do you systematically gather feedback from your audience, from podcast guests, from different coaching sessions? And then how do you use that feedback and take action on them? Do you
The
have a system
earliest
for that?
feedback that, yeah, I mean, the earliest feedback came in when, people close to me were giving compliments on the early podcast episodes. I've published 300 episodes and haven't had any new ones recently because I'm working on a lot of coaching and consulting that has come my way unexpectedly. And the reason I think it's come my way is because I've been able to get feedback early where people said, hey, normally you're a classroom teacher. You invite people like Seth Godin, Dan Pink, James Clear on the podcast. They come on, they're almost like, okay, he's a teacher. Like, what's this going to be about? He's just going to kind of just go back and forth, shoot the breeze. And one of my good friends, Kevin Wilson, said, I love this moment in the podcast, which he named the flip. It was the moment where the guests would sit up a little straighter, they'd get on their toes instead of being back on their heels, and they would realize that this is someone who's thought about the conversation systematically, very intentionally. There's a craft to it. So that was the first place where I started thinking about that. For me, I just prepared a conversation that I thought would be valuable for myself and my listeners. And then over time, I realized that the systems that I put in place on a very basic level, I'm looking for answers and examples from mindset from my guest. I'm looking for examples from language from my guest. I'm looking for examples of behaviors from my guest. Just that simple framework, Carl, put me on a road to have successful conversations. To your question about the feedback, now we started saying, hey, have you had this person on? And did you check the back of their book and they're recommending this? Then we start collecting kind of the data there. Somewhere along the line, I start recording with the help of AI every first question I've ever asked a guest. So I had an idea of what would be better questions, what got people started earlier. So there's a lot of tentacles. When you say the word system or systematic, I start thinking about a lot of different ways to interpret that. But those are some of the earliest memories I have. Maybe they started out anecdotally and then they become more systematic over time.
So I like how you said AI and how you see. I think this is an important thing to call out. We all have data from posts on social media, from our notes, from things that we've done at work. And a lot of times this data just gets lost, right? Like we might have it somewhere in our files, but it's not easy to query and it's not easy to learn from. And I like that you are putting these, I guess, transcripts into the AI and say, hey, what were some of the first questions that I've asked and that really got the juice flowing in the conversation. And I think that's fantastic. And I like to dig a little bit there because I think, I've been thinking about this with myself. I don't utilize AI. Probably none of us fully utilize AI for all its capabilities. It's so new, especially us older folks. Myself, I'm 49, so you build up habits, and you're used to doing things a certain way, and it gets harder to be like, oh, how could I use AI in this case? And I think that's a great little system that you put in place. Do you have anything else like that?
Yeah, if you think about something you just said there and a tool that people can use right away, you go on a podcast, you think about different conversation styles, and it's very prevalent, and you've seen this, that the first question is a deep background question or what I would consider a low velocity question. Now you just did the opposite. You've come in and you have to name it to kind of claim it situation. And you come in with what I call a high velocity question. I had no idea that question was coming, but what it does is get me speaking actionable tools right away, as opposed to tell us about your journey. Listeners can find out about my journey at damngoodconversations.com, or they can listen to any of the 300 episodes and they start to like, trust, know me, those kind of things. But what you've done is you know your listener and you know the listeners wants systems. Your listener wants tactics. So you come in and you do that. Interesting to go back to your previous episodes, plug in the transcript and see how many times you've done that. I mean, I've listened to a number of your episodes and you do lean heavily towards the actionable stuff. Not everybody does. Not everybody wants to. But imagine going through your transcripts, plugging in your transcripts and saying, hey, look at this as a critical eye, and then layering over that, whether it's me or another communication coach, this is Joe's framework. Layer over that. How many times are you seeing him ask an open-ended question? How many times are you seeing him ask a closed-ended question? Here's one that blows people's mind. How long does a guest go on relative to every other question they've answered? It's unbelievable how many times someone will speak for the exact same amount of time, no matter how many questions you're asked. So I have clients who will speak for 2 minutes and 22 seconds, and then the next question they answer, 2 minutes and 25 seconds. It's astounding. So even that, when I look at that lens, to me, there's a way to pull that out using AI or to have a fresh set of ears come in and listen to it. Are we being repetitive? Are we droning on the same length every time? All of those, I think, have a lens from the stuff that you're interested in.
Yeah, that's a good point. Like, yeah, so I help clients with their customer experience, like, mapping it out. Like if someone comes to you and like, hey, I need help in this, mapping out that customer journey has really helps pull you out of that regular routine and and you see those habits and you're like, oh yeah, like you forget about things. You forget, it becomes so automatic that maybe you do need to communicate a little better in certain parts of the process. But you're right. Like, I don't think I do that enough for myself. And sometimes I don't want to hire, I've hired plenty of coaches and consultants. But sometimes it's just a quick little thing that AI could give you feedback on, that you don't really need somebody to go in and listen to all these episodes for you. AI can do that. And I think coming back to the point before we started recording is, we all have to think of ourselves as leaders when we think of AI. AI is a tool, but it's the most robust tool that's probably ever been created. And if you think of it as, like hiring somebody, then it becomes something much more than, oh, I'm just trying to get it to spit out an email. You're actually learning from it. Like you would hire an employee, you're learning from that employee and that employee's learning from you. It's a two-way street. And I think when you're leading AI, you can't just think it's a one-way street. You've got to think of it as a two-way street.
Yeah, I think there's so many examples we can pull in that way, but that is the intersection of the work, right? It's leadership and it's communication. And now if we're putting in a robust tool, as you called it, how do I, and we've all heard, you got to have better prompts. You got to have better prompts. But there's a million different ways to have a better prompt. One of the things I don't think people do enough is kind of think laterally about what those prompts may be. So two quick examples come to mind. I had a client recently, very happy, but called me out on, hey, you're giving me a lot of compliments. You're being a fan of my work. And I am. He's like, I am paying you to be more critical. Can you be more critical so we can push the edges? I'll be honest, like it threw me off a little bit because I want to be a raving fan for these people. And I believe in their work if I'm taking them on as a client. So what I would do is take the text messages from this client and put them into AI. And then I'm talking, I find, and you can probably tell, I find talking it out, the velocity of getting the words out is just so much more powerful. So I'll say, hey, you have known me for a long time. It sounds weird to say that to AI, but it's true. You've known my sensibilities. You know how I communicate with people. I'll make up a name. Zach is telling me to be more critical, be more hard-edged. What is your advice to me as a solopreneur, if you will, as a leader, so that I can actionably put this into place for Zach? And I'll paste in the text messages, and now it has this incredible perspective that I can use. So that was a game changer in how I can approach quote unquote Zach. And then very practical for people. I mean, I don't think a system has to be very fancy. I know you're big on simplifying things. We need, I guess, a hot water heater, not the sexiest purchase going around. So I text the plumber today that I'm thinking about going through, and he has no idea who I am. I mean, he knows me as Joe. I know him as his name, but I don't think he has any system whatsoever that I can see, so that when my text comes in, he knows. Well, he lived here. This is the kind of sink he had. This is the kind of unit. This is how many people. He's just going ad hoc. He's saying, "All right, here comes a text from Joe. All right, well, let's start over at the beginning." And you talk about customer experience. I didn't feel bad because I got to get this purchase done. But if that's really something you want to do at scale, if people want to save time, energy, and have a tremendous experience, my plumber needs a better system so that when my name flashes across his text, he can cross check it somewhere. It's not, he could use AI for sure, but he could also use something very simple, whether it's a spreadsheet or a Google Doc or just something in his notes. So those are two, kind of a personal example and a professional example, that I think you and listeners can maybe pick apart.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I think too often we fall back into, okay, yeah, well, this is how I did it 3 years ago. This is how I did it 4 years ago. And maybe then it would have been harder, right? You have maybe a CRM of some sort, and then you could query it. But now with AI, you could once a month upload the documents from all these different conversations you have with people, the notes that you have, and now you have a much more robust way to say, okay, right before I just say, where do you live and all this, I can have these simple systems put in place to help me get the information that I need without bothering that person and them feeling like they know me. Oh man, like that sale is so much easier to go to get than it is if go in cold every time.
Totally.
Okay, so I think one of the things you really talk about is communication. I think it's so important. I've struggled with in the past. We all have struggled in the past. What frameworks or rules of the road do you have for internally? For your company, when you're communicating with clients, but you keep that communication going, you keep people updated, and you really have a way to make sure that they understand what's going on, but they're actually happy as well.
Yeah. If you think about someone, they come to someone who's a communication coach or a podcast host, and they say, "What's your favorite question to ask?" And it's so interesting to think about it like that, because that's the opposite of how I would think about it. I wish I could just roll out a list of 25 questions that I can ask anybody anytime. And there's a place for that, short segments, and you have one or two chestnuts that you want to roll out every episode. But in terms of thinking of from a systemic way or systematic way, what I'm thinking about is more holistic. I'm saying, Carl, what's your philosophy on hosting a conversation? And that usually gets people very silent. Like, wait, what are we talking about here? We're just going to be two guys on a screen. No. But when you host this and you're putting this effort in, what are you hoping to pull out of it? Is it something we want to hear user stories? Is it something that I'm going to do deep research? Am I going to research on air because we're busy people? There's a lot of philosophical ideas that you kind of put in. And I was talking to someone the other day. He had never heard that idea before. Most people haven't, because quite frankly, it's harder. It's harder at first in like many systems until you put it in place and you start saying, all right, here's how I'm going to approach every single conversation. Some people have a rule. I read the book of every guest that comes on. When I first started coaching, I was like, oh, that's a no-brainer. And then I had a client say, well, I don't have time for that. Should I just shut down the podcast? And I was like, wait, that's a great point. Not everybody has to do it. His philosophy was, I'm not going to read the book, but I'm going to honor the work. And maybe some guests won't come on because of that, and maybe some will. So right there, that's a line in the sand. And I think then you go from, all right, let's ask some questions. For me, I'm not trying to ask fancy questions, but I am trying to ask questions that maybe would pause someone and they look up to the left and they say, I never really thought of it that way. Right? We've all said that's a great question, but to me, the true compliment is when someone pauses. I had a guest on one time, and he paused 7 seconds before, high profile guest, 7 seconds before answering my question. And in the editing room, I was leaving that in. I want people to know that that person probably never heard that question before. And it's not some zany throwaway question, but it's a question that really made him think on air. So I'm not so much, for my philosophy, researching on air, but I am thinking through ideas with guests on air. So those are immediate things that come to my mind. And then I just nerd out on the craft of questions and things along those lines as well.
Mm. Yeah, because if you're doing it from your place of strength, right? Some people, you're right, they're too busy. They don't have time to research. But in your case, if you have a real familiarity with that person and it's easier, the conversation flows so much easier and you can shift it and move it in different directions where you couldn't if you didn't have that background and that knowledge from those books. And I think, no matter how you slice it, a conversation should be playful, should make the other person laugh a little bit, should at times maybe, create a little awkwardness, a long pause, because that is the type of stuff that people are like, oh, this is different than a typical type of conversation. It's why I think often, when you look at, I guess a lot of the work that you've done as a teacher, has translated into how you coach people. And I think that to me I think that's part of how you grow, right? You read people's books, but then you also pull from your past. And I'm curious how you help people optimize and how you coach them. Do you have a system of like from onboarding to what are their goals? Like what does that look like?
I listen to shows like yours to get better at systems. Let's be frank about that, because as a one person band, so to speak, and as someone who's led the classroom, the systems you use are often very different. So sometimes what I'll do on the discovery call is give away everything. And people are like, well, that's not a system. It's like, let's just let's solve your problem on the discovery call so that we don't have a system. So that's a little hump that you get over, and you're like, okay, let's get to know the person. Let's find out what they think the problem is. Then I come in with fresh ears. So that's like that's a growth point for me. When people say like, what is your framework or system? It's usually virtual, and it sounds so cliche, but you have to, in my view, customize this type of work. So that I'll be honest with you, that does sometimes pull at odds of a system, because I want to have, the system might be the container. How long are we on the call? How often do we want to meet? Those type of really nuts and bolts system things. But my last client that I just finished up with, we're talking about hosting a podcast. Whereas, I might have someone who's going on a book tour, and now that's a totally different experience to be able to sell the book without selling the book. So the framework at its simplest is, what does this client need right now? And we kind of operate from there. I know everybody says that, but I don't know any other way to do it, because I can't just say, I have an Asking Better Questions course, right? That put together, and I can hand that to you. I can sell that to you. That's a product. That's not really my bread and butter. My bread and butter is kind of either being kneecap to kneecap with someone, or being here and saying, all right, let's talk about it. The recent person said, I want to give you a look at my questions. How are they? Here's the last 20 questions I asked, and we can go through it. So round and round we go, but without customizing it, I don't know how else to do it.
Mm. Okay, so I think we all have, and this you bring up a really good point, because I think the system is you understanding what their true need is, and then if you really break it down, it's crafting that that plan so that you can meet that need, right? And it's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but that's basically a very simple system. It's like, no, well, I can't just say, here's the material because I have to understand what this person needs first, right? And I think no matter what, if you understand that higher level system, then you can start to break down what's working and what's not for that person, right? Because I think to me, where systems really thrive is understanding the main components of the system. So I just did an interview. Joanna Wiebe, she just wrote a book about marketing, and she basically said there's 36 parts to this system that along the conveyor belt of basically developing the content that the person needs to really reach their ideal client. And I find that fascinating because I think you have these 36 points, and sometimes you can just fast forward that conveyor belt. They might not need, 4 through 8 as much as somebody else does. And I think that is where you customize, right? Like you have these things in your head. And I think this is well, probably everybody for the audience. Think about how you can document that so when you're going through, you know how to hit all the right points at the right time. But yeah, at the same time, you can say, I think we're good here. Like, whatever, Alex, let's pretend you're coaching Alex, right? I think you're good here. Do you feel like you're good? And I think what that does is that person understands that you have a certain process that you're following. And then they feel more comfortable because they're like, oh, yeah, like he's hitting all these key areas, but he's making sure that I'm comfortable and then we can just move on.
Definitely. And I think it sounds a little strange to say, but sometimes the client lets you know without saying it what the system is going to be best for. I mean, one of my
Mm,
favorite clients, he's a podcast host and he's doing live interviews, which presents all kinds of different challenges in front of a studio audience, which provides different challenges. They're high profile. Now that's another layer. And what's really worked for him is he does the research. I do the research. We meet with our documents. And then we literally, as a prep for the day of air, we go through every single one of his questions that he wants to ask and we just tweak them. We make them more open ended. We make them more sharp. We make them more ability to pull out stories. I didn't really see that workflow coming, right? That's not necessarily what I would have done, but he feels most prepared in those moments. One thing that marketing woman made me think of in terms of the 36 number, once upon a time in my research and my system creation, I kind of found 22 different types of questions. So, oh, that's interesting. Open ended, closed ended is where people mostly, end. For me, I kind of got really nerdy into it, right? So I would have certain guests and communicators that'd be great writers. And then what I found is that doesn't mean they're a good podcast guest. And it's
mm.
so interesting. One has nothing to do with the other, but you can't sell books if people don't enjoy you on the podcast. So a lot of times guests will just start the story or start the answer the same way every time. But as I was talking with a young person today, you can launch into a story. So whatever question you ask me, I can do what's called a story launch. And you say, where did you learn this? I could say, when I was 17 years old, I walked over to my dad and I said, and that's just the beginning to my answer. I could do the same thing, but a different way and call it what I call a micro macro answer. I can start by saying, same question, where did you learn this? I could say, by making mistakes, period. And then I wouldn't say period, maybe making mistakes. And then I can open it up with the macro. Or maybe I can frame it. I can say, same question, where did you learn this? I can say, when I think about where I learned it, there's 3 different places I have to go to. I got to go here. I got to go here. I got to go here. And those show up time and time again in both question asking and in question answering. So those, you kind of remind me here on air, those are a system of sorts, getting people to heighten their awareness that there are multiple different ways to start every answer and there's multiple different ways to ask every question.
Yeah. And that's where it gets fun, right? If it was the same way each time, it'd be boring. And I think this is, why certain guests really pop out of the speakers and some don't. And I think you have to look at, to your point, those systems fit your strengths. If you're good at telling stories or you're good at the macro, whatever it is, that's the stuff you should be leaning on and utilizing versus, doing what you think should be right or just doing what you always do.
Yeah, definitely. And I think even with storytelling, you can get someone to understand that you got to have a 5 minute version, a 30-second version, a 10 minute version.
Mm.
And what does the situation call for?
Mm. Yeah. Because you have to be able to grab people, but you don't want to keep grabbing them and holding them for 10 minutes. And they're like, oh man, please let me go. Yeah. Yeah. And I think, those are the type of systems that you have in advance to help you create that type of or to optimize that conversation to your point, right? Like creating these great conversations, a damn good conversation requires you to have some different systems or a bag of tricks per se in your back pocket that you can pull out anytime in the right situation.
There's no doubt. And you broke up just a little bit there on the end there, so there were an audio difficulty. So let me, if you could just repeat that last question, I'll be a little cleaner with you.
No. So I just feel like if you have the ability to look at your strengths, maybe coming back to AI. So here's a little system. The idea is okay, I feel I'm really good in these areas, but I'm not great. How could I utilize this story? Maybe you have a transcript, pull it from another interview and say, here's a 10-minute version. Help me create a 1 minute version and a 30 or a 5 minute version and a 30-second version.
Yeah, I had Matthew Dix on the show, and he creates something called Homework for Life, where everybody, horrible name, but basically the idea is that every day there should be something story worthy happening in your life, and you should write it down. And you can just write, I don't know, today maybe it'd be conversation with Boris. Maybe that would be the thing, and that'd be enough of a trigger. I might write one more sentence, but you just keep a log, and then those become sifted down to where you have the yellow jacket story, and then you have the tomato story, and then you have the met Seth Godin at the conference story, and you have I didn't know where to sit, the other day in the cafeteria story, and you have them on a living, breathing document that you look at every once in a while, especially before you go on a podcast where you're asking Carl to be prepared and your audience to be invested. And then I have stories that I can pull out at any point, not for a parlor game, but to deliver value. So what is the story that would most help something be sticky in someone's brain based on that? And I think I would say most people listening have never thought about taking a story they have that they like to tell and condensing it and twisting it and telling it for four different reasons. Right then and there, that approach is going to help people.
Joe, I love that. I think that's fantastic. And I think people should pause and write a little note because you're right. Like if you have this document and you have the ability, especially if you're, you want to sell something, you want to go on podcast or you want to do a better job of, even, going out with friends, you just have this little pocket of stories that you can pull out at any time and you can say, oh yeah. And I think even with clients, right? So you're on a call with client. What if you just had this pocket of 5 stories that you review real quickly and it brings it top of mind? Because that's a wonderful system because in the end, like when you hop on these calls, you forget all the things you've done for other clients. You forget how you've helped them and different ways that you've helped them and how that those stories are much more memorable and much more helps them feel like, oh, they got me. They know what they're doing. I'm going to hire this person.
100%. And don't think because I advise that I do it 100% of the time, right? We even forget to rely on some of our systems, and the more repetition we get, the more practice we get, the more clean we get about repeating it. And then inviting people on shows like this, that's people know that us as hosts, we have sort of an unfair advantage because we get to learn from people that we really admire, and then we get reinforced. And then after this is over, I'll then remind myself that, oh, I got to go back to the story bank. It's been a while, and it's very helpful.
Yeah. And I think as you're talking, this is why case studies are a great way. To me, it comes back to the system of documentation. So I interviewed Adriana, I forget her last name, but she has a book called The 24-Hour Rule.
Mm.
And the idea is to capture the notes from a meeting, a conversation, whatever it is, within 24 hours. Because back to homework for life, the idea is you capture it, even if it's just a couple quick little highlights, right? And then you can always go back to it later. And this is coming back to systems is how do you do that? How do you come back to that stuff later? And the idea is to have a little system of like, oh, at the end of every day, I write down a little story, what happened in this interview. And for me, like I I feel this connection to you because you are also a podcast host. But you've had a day job. So I had a day job. I just recently got let go. So for me, this is an opportunity. I'm like, okay, wait, if I have the freedom to go all in on my podcast, to do all these things, this allows me more time to create these systems, to document, to capture these stories and do it consistently, and to be able to say, oh, okay, like I'm going to keep doing these things, or I'm going to try to make them a little better. And that comes back to, you said you interviewed James Clear. Do you have a system? And it sounds like you kind of do, of you putting in questions, and you have, 20 different questions, different types of questions. And my long-winded way of saying, do you have a way of improving by 1% a little bit with each podcast, or with your coaching clients, or whatever it is?
I hope so. While you were talking, I had thought, what a simple way to do it would be if I, at the end of every day, wrote down the best question I was asked today, and then wrote down the best question I asked today. And whether I was right or wrong, that after 365, you have 700 questions, and all you're asking for is one. And then you could look at that and you can say, wow. It's so funny that you say that, because it had never even occurred to me until you talked. In terms of the way to improve 1%, when you think of whether it's James Clear's Atomic Habits, or you think about how do I keep going, I used to be very big on something I named high velocity questions. I mentioned it earlier. So when I started looking at what my first questions were, I always thought, well, I know I don't want to ask, low and slow questions. So let's go back and look. I'm probably asking really high velocity questions. And as I used the transcript and I looked at my first question, because I think the first question is so important. It sets the tone. It gets you going. It's like it gives you a sense of the attention span of audience, the whole thing. It turned out that really what I was doing a lot of times was not so much super high velocity, but it was almost a question before you get into the meat, but it wasn't what is a traditional icebreaker. So I ended up calling it a point 0.5 question. Like everyone has their first question they're going to ask, but we're recording. And then what's the question you could ask that would kind of get things started with a little bit of warmth, right? It wouldn't like dive into the deep end of the pool, but it would be something like, I don't know. An example comes to mind. I had a coach on, a mental performance coach, and I was just about to go skiing. So the first question of the day is not about his work per se. It's like, Michael, thank you for being here. Welcome to 1% Better. Hi, Joe. Great to see you. Michael, I'm 43 years old. I'm about to go skiing for the first time. What is it that I need to be mentally and physically prepared for before I go skiing? And he starts cracking up, because literally, and not even figuratively, literally, no one's ever asked him that question on a podcast before, because he's going there thinking the first question is going to be, Michael, tell me about your journey. You just wrote this great book. I know you just interviewed LeBron James, whatever it is. And we just hit him from the side door slightly without being zany. And that was something I only discovered because I had every question, 300 of them that I had asked. And I think we're bad at this. Our memories are bad. I thought I was asking these hard-hitting questions. I wouldn't really describe that question, what do I need to know about skiing, as hard-hitting, but I would describe it as a way of intersecting his interest, his expertise, and what's going on in my life with what could be going on in someone else's life who's listening. Because if someone skied before, now they're perked up. They're like, is he going to say what I would tell him to say this? Or if someone hasn't skied before, they're like, wow, Joe's scratching an itch I didn't even know I had. So I learned the hard way by having to look at the black and white text right in front of me. Now, Joe, you're not asking hard hitting questions all the time. You got to be a little more accurate.
Mm. Now you're making me question my first question that I asked you and how you looked at it. You kind of analyzed it right at the beginning of this podcast, and you're right. It does set the tone, and it's important. And sometimes I I don't go with the first question. I will just go with something that triggered me as before we hit record. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. And
I
I,
agree.
I have to be a little more conscious of how I make those decisions. And that's a really important insight. No matter what, if you're going to present something to a leadership team, or you have to have a way to pique their interest and do it in a way where questions are really powerful, because you could say, hey, what do you feel is the greatest issue that you're having right now, right? Whatever it is. And that gets everybody thinking before you start giving your presentation or whatever it is. I think that's really powerful. And I think people should stop there and think about, the first question that you have when you meet up with a friend, or when you meet with a new client. What are those questions, and how are you starting that conversation to make them feel comfortable?
And as a 1% better nudge, if you will, one way to get better real quick, if I was teaching someone who's giving a presentation, which I do have clients that do that, the temptation is to have your first slide be a really cool shot of you with like this nice like horizontal line and your contact information. So everyone's finding their seat. Excuse me. They're looking and just, but that's actually a wasted opportunity. So the point five question that gets us right into the action equivalent of a first slide is have that question that you just asked that was dynamite on the screen already. So they're walking in and the question's already on the screen, right? It says, what's the biggest obstacle you had this week? Or it says something like, what's the best question you've ever been asked? And then maybe it says Joe Ferraro in the bottom right. So then as they're settling into their seat and getting their coffee, that's a good question. Doris asked me the other day, and it's already started. I tell people the presentation begins before the presentation begins. That can be a
Hmm.
host getting me settled in my seat. That could be how you made me feel comfortable before we hit record. That could be a system. And again, you're getting me thinking. Every time I hit record for at least the last 150 episodes, I would say, Carl, thank you so much for being here, man. It's a true pleasure. Just want to let you know, we build this conversation together. Anything you say, it can come out. There's no questions asked. I can edit it any way you want. My job here is to highlight you and to build something special together. But it's super important to me that we build this conversation together. So even that is a repetition, 150 episodes deep, where people seem to appreciate it. And it's sort of like the hostess at the beginning of the restaurant. What's the music? How do they welcome you? Do they take your coat? That's the whole kit and caboodle, if you will, of the conversation starts before the conversation starts, or the presentation starts before the presentation begins.
Yes. Yeah. And you're making me think of, I forget, there's a study that basically 90% of our decisions are on autopilot. And we
Mm,
built up these systems for years, right? And back to your point is, well, now you try to create this welcoming and like, hey, we're in this together type of atmosphere. But it took you a while to get there. And
yeah.
when's the last, well, have you thought about tweaking it, right? Like, okay, what else could I adjust this a little bit? Could I get them to share a little bit more deeply, a little bit faster, and to get my audience truly engaged quickly? And there's just it's systems are beautiful, but they are a curse too. And I think this is where people struggle, is they don't want to feel like, oh, like I'm just this robot, or I just always do it this way. I'm creative. I don't. And it's like, well, yeah, but we all need guardrails and we all need support. And to me, that's why a good system allows you to create that support, but also I like to think of it a system like Lego blocks too. Sometimes you can pull out different parts of that system and say, I want to improve this little area right here. And when you do that and you do that consistently, you're creating this culture for your company, for your classroom or whatever, that allows you to say, no, we're going to keep growing. We're going to keep improving. Even though I developed this, I'm not married to it. I just want us to keep improving and keep growing together. That's sending a signal, right? And so you can do that again and again and again in different scenarios, and it allows you to be more present, but also, say, hey, back to your point, we're in this together, and I'm here to help you and create a great conversation.
And your point about guardrails is so important. I've even been getting more playful about narrowing the guardrails more. What happens if we narrow them? We still have a thin lane, but not enough that we're going to go like off the road, so to speak. So sometimes people say to me, I'm thinking of starting a podcast, and we start those conversations. And then just a simple example, someone will be like, I really want to talk about education. I think it's a big, with AI, I think it's a big point right now. I want to do a podcast on education. And if I want to cut to the end of that story, it really ends with me saying, that's wonderful, but you'd be better off doing a podcast for left-handed teachers in Indiana.
Mm.
And they're like, what? That's way too narrow. I'm like, no, like that's how specific. There's so many podcasts out there that if you want to build an audience and you want to be creative, every left-handed teacher in Indiana will listen to it. And maybe it'll never go viral, but you'll become the expert for that community, whether you want to use Seth Godin's tribes mentality or whether you want to, publish in public mentality. You can do it a million different ways, but it's your point that unlocked that, which is there needs to be guardrails for creativity to flourish.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's what helped me. I used to call the podcast Dig to Fly, which is very broad. We dig deep to fly high. And I still use a lot of those same concepts in these interviews, but it's much more focused around the systems that people build. Because I think it's just cool to see how people think and how their brain works, and to hear them explain it. And I feel maybe I even did a poor job of, I like to ask people the why behind their systems. Like, why did you develop it in that way? And so maybe before we move on to the 5 minute system, I'm just curious, why did you develop the podcast the way that you have? Because I think if you really break it down, there's so much. It is very broad, right? Great conversations, but then you dig deeper and it becomes about the questions. I'm curious about where that came from.
Yeah, you're 100% spot on when you think about like even my podcast, 1% Better or damngoodconversations.com. It violates that rule in a sense.
Mhm.
But that was started in 2017, my first podcast in 2014 before we knew better. And you start to say, okay, that's not left-handed educators in Indiana. I thought you had to be broad at that point, but I realize now that would not be what I do starting over. Now, when it comes to the conversation crafts, though, let's lean into damn good conversations. What is the point? Well, the point is the world changes when you have a great conversation. You sit up a little straighter, you feel connected. One of my podcast guests, Dan Simon, said 1+1=3. I still think about that all the time. We're creating something else that didn't exist. I think about the scene from Sideways, the wine movie. The same bottle of wine tomorrow, opened in a different way, in a different time, with more time to breathe, will be organic. We could record this conversation tomorrow. It'll be totally different. You could even say, I'm going to ask the same exact questions. I'm not going to answer the same way. There's a chemical component to it. You've chosen your partner. You've chosen your questions. You've chosen your follow-ups. That's how deep I like to go in terms of digging deeper to fly higher. I mean, it's the world is a better place when the conversations are better. And people are so limited with time that I feel that it's a generous act to be prepared and to help people be prepared. I think it's a creative act to have a conversation. Ask somebody a creative act. They'll tell you painting, drawing, sculpture. Conversation's incredibly creative. You have a decision tree right now as I'm talking, Carl, going off in your head where you're like, I don't know where I want to go next. I have so many choices. If I go left, I can't go right. Exactly. And there's nothing wrong with that. You go left, you never look back. And if I can help people get, dare I say, 1% better at having better conversations, having better interviews, having better presentations, I want that to exist in the world.
Yes. Yes. Beautiful. Okay, I think that's perfect. This gives us time to do our 5 minute system segment. Where can people go to find out more about you?
I went downstairs and I bought the domain damngoodconversations.com because someone asked me, how do you describe your podcast in 3 words? And I was like, I don't know, they're damn good conversations. And it felt a little braggadocious at the time, but I bought the domain. I've been really happy with it. And if you go to damngoodconversations.com, you'll find the podcast, you'll find the client work, you'll find free content. And I really appreciate you giving me the opportunity to share that today, Carl.
Yeah, of course. Of course. Thank you.
You're welcome.